Tom, this is an interesting moment. President Trump's recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital. What's the reaction been in the media internationally?
Well, the media's reacted with near predictable unanimity. For example, the subject line of the New Yorker's newsletter, which was emailed to thousands of subscribers, reads, "Trump sabotages the Mideast peace process." Or one of the headlines in the Financial Times today reads, "Trump's dangerous decision on Jerusalem, recognizing the holy city as Israel's capital, is a senseless provocation." The BBC, I heard earlier, have highlighted remarks, some would call them hysterical, of people like Turkish President Erdogan, who announced, as a result of Trump's intention to effectively just move an office building from Tel Aviv to West Jerusalem, Erdogan said, "The entire world is now a less safe place."
Well, that's all pretty negative. What about other politicians around the world?
Well, I saw a tweet by British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. He wrote, "Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is a dangerous threat to peace." What I find slightly amusing is that Corbyn has been hanging out with Hamas as if that's not a threat to peace. Other politicians, quite a lot of them have said simply the peace process is over.
And do you think it is?
No, I don't think so. On the contrary, Trump's move, far from ending peace talks, which in any case have hardly been going anywhere for years, I think will more likely revive them. You know, if you read the subtext of what Trump and his Mideast envoy Kushner and some of the advisors who are close to Netanyahu and to the Saudi leadership are saying, I have a feeling it may well ultimately be Israeli hardliners who will be as disappointed by their policies as Palestinian ones. I think there's every indication that Israel and the Arab world, together with the US, are drawing up plans for a two-state solution. It might not be the exact two-state solution that the Palestinian leadership wants or demands, but I think it will be enough to end the conflict. The Arab governments in particular, I think, have had enough of Palestinian intransigence, and they're much more concerned now about the Iranian threat and about their own domestic problems. And, you know, the Palestinian issue, which served their purposes in the past, is no longer politically useful for them as it used to be. This is really something I hear when I speak to them in private.
You mentioned Iran. We know why Israel's worried about Iran. What about the Arab states? Why are they worried?
Well, they're very worried. Iran's virtually taken over Syria, large parts of Iraq and Lebanon, and it's attempting to exert control in Yemen and Bahrain and elsewhere. And the Sunni Arab states want and need cooperation with Israel. And at the same time, they're tired of the Palestinians' refusal to negotiate with Israel. They're tired of the issue. You know, even Hamas's main Arab backer, Qatar, has recently been holding behind-the-scene talks with Israel. And of course, the Arab states are also worried about the Iranian nuclear threat, as is Israel. Neither party feels the Obama's nuclear deal has properly thwarted this Iranian nuclear threat.
One of the biggest criticisms of Trump's speech has been that people think it ignores any Palestinian ambitions over Jerusalem. Do you agree?
If you read them closely, Trump's carefully chosen words on recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital have not closed this possibility, I think. Indeed, I think that one day other parts of Jerusalem may indeed serve as a capital of Palestine. It won't be easy, but arrangements can be made. But what we need first of all is for the Palestinian leadership to start to negotiate in a realistic way, in good faith, to recognize Israel once and for all, to end their encouragement for terrorism. You know, nowhere in world history, to my knowledge, has the party that lost militarily, and in this conflict it will be the Palestinians, been allowed to dictate the terms of peace. It certainly wasn't after, for example, the First or Second World Wars. Conflicts end when the party that wins dictates the terms of peace. Now, of course, Israel should be generous to the Palestinians so that the peace will hold, but it's the international community, or some among them, that have done a disservice to the Palestinians to encourage them not to compromise, to encourage them to hold out for everything.
But the Palestinians have got their own complaints, though. They'll say that the negotiations haven't helped with things like the occupation.
Well, first of all, successive Israeli prime ministers have offered them an end to the occupation, or almost all of it. I think Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert offered them 98% of what they wanted with land swaps, which was a little bit more than Ehud Barak, who'd already made them, a generous offer. And there are many other peoples in the world that would like independent states. And can you imagine, to name but three of them, the Tibetans or the Kurds or the Chechens, saying no if they were offered independence on 98% of the land they said they wanted? And yet the Palestinians have said no, and they've walked away from negotiations when they've been made similar offers by Israel. And again, I think it's certain diplomats in Western governments that have encouraged them to do so, and they have not actually helped the Palestinian path to independence in doing so.
But the Palestinians say they are eager to negotiate, that they just aren't getting what they need from those negotiations.
Well, I think that's a bit disingenuous of them. Barack Obama, who was generally, well disposed to the Palestinian cause, through both his terms in office, through 8 years, he pleaded with them to negotiate, as did his Secretaries of State, Hillary Clinton and then John Kerry. And yet in those entire 8 years, I think the President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority agreed to sit down for only 4 hours with the Israelis. And there was no price to pay. The Palestinian Authority continued to be very generously funded by America and many other countries. Abbas was treated not just like he was the leader of a sovereign state, but even as though he was the leader of a very important one. He was wined and dined at the White House and at the Elysee Palace and at 10 Downing Street as if he was a major world leader. And meanwhile, the money flowed in, and indeed many of the cronies around Abbas lined their pockets with it. So the only way to break this impasse is to do something along the lines of what Trump has done, which is to slightly move the goalposts and make them realize that by doing nothing, things may change and America will recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
But the problem with all of that is that so many people are deeply suspicious of both Trump and Netanyahu, and they just don't believe that they want a Palestinian state at all. Do you really think that they're going to help create one?
Yes, I think potentially they will. Once the Palestinians negotiate realistically, and I see the Saudis and other Arab states pressuring them to do so at this point, I think there's a distinct chance that Trump and Netanyahu will preside over the creation of a Palestinian state, and indeed that state will encompass some bits of the present municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. And I don't think the relocation of the US Embassy to West Jerusalem makes any difference. All it does is place it near the Israeli Knesset and other seats of government. It still allows parts of East Jerusalem to eventually become a Palestinian capital.
Well, that's quite true. It doesn't. I noticed that too in his choice of words. And so much of the coverage totally ignored the room left in his speech for the Palestinians. But most people simply don't buy this idea that Trump and Netanyahu will deliver. You've been closely observing the conflict for a long time, and I know you've got discreet contacts on both sides at very high level. Do you really think that these two much maligned leaders are the ones who can pull this off?
Yes, I do. Look, even though they're regarded as warmongers rather than potential peacemakers, time and again we've seen hardliners being the ones that actually do deals with their enemies. So, for example, Nixon reached an understanding with the Chinese communists. Reagan and Thatcher did a deal with the Soviets. So yes, and I also say this with some confidence because as an independent observer who speaks to all sides without having to represent anybody other than myself, I hear things and it allows me to think outside the box somewhat. I remember some years ago when I had lunch in Jerusalem with Alan Rusbridger, who was then the editor of The Guardian, and his deputy Ian Katz. I told them that I thought Ariel Sharon would likely withdraw from territory, including Gaza, and this was 3 years before Sharon announced it. And Rusbridger and Katz said they thought I was mad and I didn't know what I was talking about. And they said that everyone knew Sharon was a war criminal who would never make such gestures for peace. But as we see, my prediction did in fact come to turn out to be correct. Now, It's true that Benjamin Netanyahu is less courageous in making moves than Sharon has been, but nevertheless, I don't think that Netanyahu wants to end his long stay in power being compared to, for example, Yitzhak Shamir, who was a previous Likud prime minister who did nothing. I think that Netanyahu, if he can get a deal, would like to go out as a statesman, as indeed I think Trump would.
But with the Middle East in such turmoil at the moment and Trump, Mr. America First, in charge of the United States, is this really the opportune moment for that?
Well, I think Netanyahu knows that it's in Israel's long-term interest to disentangle themselves with the Palestinians and allow them independence, as long as any independent state won't then threaten Israel, and that state genuinely recognises Israel's right to exist. And I think that Netanyahu knows there may never be a better opportunity. He has a friend in Donald Trump in the White House. He has Vladimir Putin in power in Moscow, who's certainly less hostile than previous Russian leaders. And then he has relatively favourable leaderships in Saudi Arabia, in India, in China, and in many other countries, for example, in Africa. So I think this is possibly the time to re-offer the Palestinians what they were offered by previous Prime Ministers Olmert and Barak. And at this time, I think the Saudis, Americans and others will pressure the Palestinians to accept it. They'll say, you're not going to get 100% of what you want, you're going to get 97% of what you want, and that will be that, and we're not going to go on funding you and treating you like a sovereign state and supporting your cause if you don't. I don't think there's any reason this conflict can't be solved. Some people think it can't be solved. I think we need a new approach, and it can be solved.
Interesting times indeed. Thanks very much for that. Thanks for your insight.
Thank you.